Why did everyone look at her like she didn't belong there? The dust of forward operating base Nightingale clung to everything, to boots, to lungs, to the soul. It turned the world into a colorless painting of beige and silence. When Captain Alina Rostova stepped off the helicopter, she didn't flinch as the rotor wash whipped her dark hair into her eyes. She just stood there, small against the endless desert, holding a single duffel bag. Her expression unreadable. Her presence quiet but heavy, like a memory that refuses to fade. Captain Rostova, a young corporal, jogged up, his voice cracked from heat and nerves. "Corporal Tanaka, ma'am, welcome to the Rock, med tense this way." She nodded once. No smile, no greeting. Her gaze wasn't on him, it was scanning the perimeter. Every tower, every stretch of wire, every line of sight. Her eyes didn't see a base, they saw a map of weaknesses. From the doorway of the command post, Colonel Marcus Thorne watched her approach, coffee mug in hand. He was the kind of man who measured worth by posture and paperwork, and everything about this woman screamed misplaced. Late 40s, lean, no visible muscle but no softness either. A medic's insignia on her collar, a transfer from a hospital in Germany. The kind of officer whose biggest threat was an infection, not an ambush. He smirked. "Just a nurse," he muttered to his XO. "Let's make sure she knows where the bandages are." The words were quiet, but they hung in the air like smoke. Alina stopped a few paces from him, the wind lifting the fine dust into her face. Their eyes met for a heartbeat, his full of quiet condescension, hers unreadable. For a brief second, Thorne felt something strange, like he was being evaluated, dissected. Then it was gone. She turned back to the corporal, and that calm, flat composure returned. He didn't know it yet, but the most dangerous weapon in that entire valley had just stepped off the helicopter. That night, as the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks surrounding the base, the world turned the color of blood and rust. Alina sat alone on her bunk in the medical tent, her duffel open. Inside were the expected items, medical kits, field manuals, personal effects. But beneath them, wrapped in a clean cloth, lay a small black notebook. She ran her fingers across its cover without opening it. Then she tucked it back inside. The sound of laughter drifted in from outside, young soldiers swapping stories, teasing, trying to forget where they were. She listened for a moment. Then softly she whispered to no one, "Quiet's not peace. It just means the noise hasn't found you yet." The next morning, at the staff briefing, she stood silently near the edge of the room as Colonel Thorne spoke. His voice carried the easy arrogance of command, a man who believed that tone alone could enforce respect. "Captain Rostova," he said finally, glancing her way, "glad you could join us. Your file says you've been at Landstuhl for a few years. Paper cuts and ski injuries, I imagine." A few junior officers laughed. Her gaze didn't shift. Her hands were loosely clasped behind her back. "Yes, sir," she said. No emotion, no reaction. Thorne smiled wider, like he'd scored a point. "Out here, things get a little more kinetic. Your primary role will be the aid station. Keep the aspirin counted and the gauze sterile. Can you handle that?" He wanted a reaction, a hint of pride, a spark of resentment, but there was none. "Yes, Colonel." It wasn't defiant, it wasn't surrender, it was acceptance. And that unsettled him more than an argument would have. "Good," he muttered and turned back to the map. "Now, as I was saying." But his words blurred as he noticed her eyes fixed on the topographic display. They weren't scanning idly, they were tracking, measuring, thinking. She was focused on a single sector, Kylon Pass, a narrow route cut through the northern ridge. His best tacticians had flagged it as low risk. Her gaze lingered there too long. He almost asked her what she saw, but then the thought embarrassed him. What could a nurse possibly see that he had? After the briefing, as the officers filed out, Thorne called to her. "One more thing, Captain. We've got a congressional visit in 2 weeks. I want you to personally oversee sanitation, latrines, mess hall, the works." The room went silent for a beat. Everyone knew what that was, a deliberate insult. Elena met his gaze for 3 long seconds, then nodded. Understood, Colonel. She turned and walked out. When the door closed, Thorne realized his coffee had gone cold. He told himself he'd put her in her place, but somehow it didn't feel like victory. It felt like he'd thrown a stone at a mountain, and the mountain hadn't even noticed. Over the next week, Elena worked quietly, methodically, supervising sanitation crews and med checks. The soldiers resented it at first. A captain ordering them to scrub floors felt absurd, but she never shouted, never demeaned. "Shorter strokes," she said to a young private scrubbing tile. "Use your weight, not your wrist. It's more efficient." The private blinked, surprised by the calm tone. Tried it, it worked. "Yes, ma'am." Soon the resentment began to fade. There was something steadying about her. She made even humiliation feel like purpose. But her mind wasn't on mops or disinfectant. Every inspection, every errand was reconnaissance. While checking plumbing, she noticed the main water line exposed, running parallel to a fuel pipe. One hit there and the base would bleed out twice. While walking the perimeter inspecting trash sites, she timed the distance between guard towers. 300 meters too far apart. A dead zone, perfect for infiltration. She watched the patrol schedules, predictable, repetitive. Every day, same routes, same times. It was suicide disguised as routine. She wrote it all down, precise, clinical notes in that small black book. No one knew. No one cared. She was just a nurse. But she was mapping their graves before anyone else saw the shovels. At night, she sat alone in the med tent, reorganizing supplies. Sergeant Miller, who'd run the station for a year, watched her shuffle shelves. "Never seen it done that way, Captain," he said. "It's faster," she replied without looking up. Everything she did was intentional. The instruments, the routines, the silences. And then one afternoon, as she cleaned surgical tools outside, she heard it. A faint, rhythmic chirp from the command post radio, buried in static. It was the kind of interference most would ignore, a side effect of bad weather or poor encryption. But she tilted her head slightly, the way a predator tilts its ear toward the rustle of grass. That wasn't interference. It was patterned, deliberate, weak, unsophisticated, but not random. Someone out there was listening, testing. She wrote a single line in her notebook. Kylon Pass frequency 46 gigahertz. Intermittent jamming. Probable enemy observation post. High risk for patrols. Then she closed the book and went back to cleaning the instruments. She didn't report it. She knew how that would go. A nurse talking about signal intelligence. The colonel would laugh her out of the room. So she waited. Waited for the next piece of the pattern. And it came 3 days later, just after 1400 hours. The loudspeaker crackled across the base. "Watchtower 2, this is CIC. We've lost contact with Wolverine 3. Last known position Grid 749er, Kylon Pass." The med tent fell silent. Elena froze, only for a fraction of a second, but enough for Corporal Tanaka to notice. Her hand, steady moments before, stopped mid-motion above a tourniquet. Kylon Pass. She'd seen it coming. Outside, the wind began to rise, a wall of brown dust rolling toward the valley. A haboob, a storm that could choke an engine and blind a drone. In the command post, Thorne's voice crackled over the radio, sharp with frustration. "Get me Wolverine 3 back on the line. Boost the signal." "Nothing static." "Primary and secondary channels are dead, sir," a young lieutenant said, panic creeping into his voice. "Could be the storm." "I don't need excuses," Thorne barked. "Where's my quick reaction force?" "Standing by, sir, but visibility's collapsing. Sending them blind would be suicide." The colonel slammed his hand on the console. "Then do something." The CIC descended into chaos, overlapping voices, clattering keyboards, the suffocating hum of uncertainty. And in the middle of that storm of fear and noise, Elena stood up, calm, silent. She handed the training dummy's arm back to Tanaka. "Hold pressure," she said softly. Then she walked toward the command center. She didn't run, she didn't shout. She just moved steady as gravity. Inside, the room was pure panic. Thorne yelling, officers scrambling, radios screeching. No one noticed her enter, until she was already there. She brushed past the main consoles, straight to a corner where an old, unused satellite terminal sat covered in dust. Her fingers danced over the keys, quick, sure, practiced. "What the hell do you think you're doing, nurse?" Thorne barked. She didn't look up. "Listening," she said. "Listening," he snapped. "You're out of line." Her hands kept moving. Lines of code flashed across the terminal. She bypassed encryption, isolated the signal, filtered noise, each movement precise, surgical. "I'm not shouting through the storm, Colonel," she murmured. "I'm listening to it." And then on the screen, a flicker, a heartbeat in the static. "There," she whispered. The room fell silent. Within 90 seconds, she triangulated the signal, scribbled a coordinate, and handed it to the major in charge of the Quick Reaction Force. "Grid 76 Bravo, 2 kilometers northeast. They're in a ravine. Ambush likely on the ridge." Then she tore a second note, handed it to Tanaka, one word, "ambush." And she left. No speech, no explanation, just the quiet confidence of someone who knew she was right. Behind her, the command center stared. Even Thorne couldn't speak. For the first time, they weren't looking at a nurse. They were looking at a mystery. Outside, the storm swallowed the sky. And somewhere in that chaos, 4 men were alive because she'd heard a sound no one else could. How could a whisper in the static save lives? No one in that command room knew. They only knew it happened and that she'd done it. For 20 long minutes, the desert howled. The storm swallowed sound, vision, and hope. The live feed from the gunships flickered in and out, their lenses coated in dust. Static, blurs, a flash of light, then nothing. Colonel Thorne paced behind the consoles like a caged animal. Every step ground grit beneath his boots. "Anything?" he snapped. "Negative, sir. We've lost telemetry." The major swallowed hard. "They're flying blind." Thorne forced a smirk, brittle and forced. "Told you, a wild goose chase." But even he didn't sound convinced. Then through the static, a voice. "Havoc 1 to CIC, we have visual. Multiple survivors in the ravine. Engaging enemy positions North Ridge, exactly as briefed." The room erupted. Shouts, relief, disbelief. A few officers cheered. Others just stared at the map as the blue icons blinked solid. The impossible had turned real. Thorne's smirk cracked. His throat went dry. "Repeat, Havoc 1 confirmed." "Confirmed, sir. 2 KIA-2 alive. We're bringing them home." Silence. The kind that swallows sound because emotion fills the space instead. Thorne lowered his head. And behind him, the door to the CIC closed softly, the echo of boots disappearing into the dust. The nurse hadn't stayed for applause. That night, as the storm faded, the helicopters limped back through the dark. The med tent glowed faintly under floodlights. Inside, Captain Rostova worked without pause. She moved between stretchers with quiet precision, cleaning wounds, stabilizing fractures, whispering calm words that anchored panic. One of the rescued men gripped her sleeve with trembling fingers. His face was blood-streaked, eyes wide. "They came out of nowhere," he rasped. "Comms just died. We thought we were done." She pressed a morphine injector to his arm. "You're not done," she said softly. "Breathe." Colonel Thorne stood in the doorway, arms crossed. He didn't speak. He watched as she wiped blood from the sergeant's face, her expression utterly calm, no trace of pride, no demand for recognition. He realized, with an ache he couldn't name, that she wasn't performing miracles for him. She wasn't performing at all. She was just doing the work. Outside, the base buzzed with rumor. Soldiers repeated the story like gospel. She just walked in and took over the comms. Didn't ask permission, just fixed it. Colonel looked like he'd swallowed his own rank. No one used her name anymore. They just said the nurse. By dawn, the tale had spread to every watchtower and barracks bunk. And in the quiet hours, those who'd laughed at her arrival stared at their boots, wondering what else she might be capable of. Morning came dull and gray, the sky the color of wet ash. The desert smelled of ozone and dust. Colonel Thorne couldn't sleep. He'd spent the night replaying every detail, the static, her voice, the impossible signal recovery. At breakfast, his executive officer tried to lighten the mood. "Hell of a lucky break, sir. Probably just instinct." Thorne didn't reply. He only muttered, "No such thing as instinct that good." He opened her personnel file again, the one he'd barely read before. It said all the same things: medical officer, administrative rotation, exemplary service record, nothing special. But near the bottom his eye caught a single line. Previous assignments, undisclosed per Joint Special Operations Command. He frowned, classified, for a nurse. He tried to access the addendum. The screen blinked red, clearance insufficient. He closed the file slowly. For the first time, authority didn't comfort him. It felt like a wall keeping him out. In the med tent, Alina was already working. Supplies restocked, stretchers cleaned, everything in perfect order. She gave orders in a voice so calm it silenced panic by proximity. Private Aisha Jamil, the same young woman who'd scrubbed floors under her supervision days ago, stood nearby, wrapping gauze around a soldier's arm. She kept stealing glances at Alina, eyes full of a kind of quiet awe. "Ma'am," she asked finally, "how'd you know where they were with the storm and all?" Alina didn't look up from her work. "You learn to listen to what others ignore." "Still," Jamil murmured, "it was like you'd done that before." Alina paused, her hands stilling mid-motion. For a heartbeat, something flickered across her face, not pride, not guilt, something heavier. Then it was gone. She taped the bandage, nodded once. "Experience has a way of following you," she said. Jamil didn't understand the meaning, but she felt its weight. 3 days later, the base began to move differently. Patrol schedules tightened. Communications protocols revised. Every weak spot Alina had silently noted was suddenly being reviewed. But no one knew by whom. The colonel never mentioned her. He issued the orders himself, corrections written neatly on folded slips of paper left on his desk each morning. He never saw her leave them, yet he knew exactly whose handwriting it was. Sometimes when the mess hall quieted, Thorne caught himself watching her through the dusty window. She'd sit at a table with her back straight, sipping black coffee, reading nothing, just thinking. He'd always believed command meant control. That rank was the measure of worth. Now he was starting to see it differently. Maybe real control was the ability to stay calm when the world lost its mind. Maybe authority wasn't granted. Maybe it was earned in silence. At dusk, the mountains around FOB Nightingale turned blood-red. The heat shimmered off the sandbags, and the valley exhaled a long, uneasy sigh. Alina sat outside the med tent, notebook in her lap. The pages were filled with lines of data, coordinates, patterns, habits, every weakness the enemy could exploit. She turned to a fresh page and wrote, "Observation complete. Attack probable. Recommend perimeter reinforcement, Sector Gamma." She tore the page out, folded it neatly, and set it on her knee. For a long moment she just stared at the horizon, the sun bleeding out behind the peaks. She whispered under her breath, "Please, not tonight." Because she already knew it would be. It began 2 nights later. Not with gunfire, with a sound deeper, the thump of distant mortars rolling through the valley. The first shell hit near the fuel depot, the second closer. The alarm screamed. Soldiers scrambled half awake, boots unlaced, grabbing rifles. The night erupted in red flashes and echoing thunder. Inside the CIC, chaos returned. Impact near West Gate. Sector Gamma breached. Tower 4's gone dark. Colonel Thorne barked orders over the din, but it was like shouting at the ocean. His command net fractured under noise and fear. In the med tent, Alina didn't look up as the first wounded poured in. "Lay him here," she said. "Pressure on that artery, Jamil, compress." Her tone cut through the panic like steel through cloth. Then a runner burst in, soot-covered, wide-eyed. "Captain, the breach in Gamma's bad. Lieutenant Howard's down, Sergeant Chun's gone, no leadership left. We're getting torn apart." Alina tied off a bandage, her motions precise. The tent was chaos around her, moans, blood, fear. She looked up at the runner, then at the dozen terrified soldiers crowding behind him. She made a decision. "Sergeant Miller," she said evenly, "you have triage, keep them alive." Then she turned to Jamil and Tanaka. "You're with me." She walked to the supply locker and kicked it open. Inside, 3 M4 rifles, emergency issue. She handed one to each of them, checked her own with muscle memory too smooth to belong to a medic. Tanaka's hand shook. "Ma'am, what are we doing?" She chambered around, fixing the problem. Outside, the base burned. They moved through smoke and chaos. A small, makeshift unit of medics, support staff, and walking, wounded carrying stretchers as shields. Alina led from the front, moving with eerie confidence. Every explosion was cover. Every flicker of muzzle flash was data. She used the noise the way an artist uses color to paint their path. Tracer fire carved glowing arcs in the air. The sand sprayed around them, hot and stinging. Jamil returned fire toward a rooftop as Alina pointed. "Short bursts," Alina ordered. 2 seconds, don't waste ammo." "Yes, ma'am." They reached the edge of Sector Gamma. The scene was hell, barriers shredded, a Humvee overturned, bodies half buried in dirt. Alina crouched behind cover, her breathing slow, steady. "Tanaka, radio." He fumbled with the handset. "Static, ma'am." She adjusted the frequency, calm. "Use med station call sign, Nightingale 6. Her tone carried the certainty of command. She glanced around at the frightened soldiers. "You 5 stretchers down, rifles up. Aim center breach, fire on my mark." They stared at her like she'd lost her mind. But when she looked at them, really looked, something inside them steadied. When she said, "Mark," they fired. The air filled with thunder. The enemy advance slowed, confused by the sudden resistance from a direction they hadn't expected. Above them, the rotor of a grounded resupply helicopter screamed to life. Sergeant Major Davies, the crew chief, scanned the battlefield through his optics. He froze. He'd seen that posture before, the way she moved, directed, fought. He switched to the command channel. "Colonel Thorne, this is 7-9. You need to hear this." Thorne's voice was ragged. "What is it?" Davies' reply came like a gunshot. "You've got SPECTRE on the ground. I repeat, SPECTRE is active on your perimeter." The colonel blinked. "Who the hell is SPECTRE?" Davies almost laughed, disbelieving. "Captain Alina Rostova, Special Operations Command. That's not a nurse, sir, she's a legend." The CIC fell silent. Only the distant gunfire spoke. Thorne's hands trembled as he pulled up her file again, bypassing protocols with his emergency clearance. Lines of black redaction peeled away. He read the words operations, commendations, ghost protocol, and his face drained of color. He'd made her clean toilets. And now she was saving his base. Outside, under the choking dust, Captain Alina Rostova, SPECTRE, crouched behind the wrecked Humvee, reloading. Her eyes glowed faintly with reflected firelight. She called over the radio, voice calm, crisp, unwavering. "All stations, this is Nightingale 6. Redirect fire 100 meters north of the breach. Crossfire pattern Charlie. Move." Every soldier within earshot obeyed without hesitation, because She sounded like someone who could see the whole war at once. The tide of battle began to turn. And in the command center, Colonel Thorne stood motionless, headset pressed to his ear, listening to the woman he dismissed as just a nurse command his entire defense. Who was she really? That was the question burning through every soldier's mind, from the trembling private clutching his rifle in the dirt, to the colonel staring blankly at the map inside the command center. Who was this quiet woman who now sounded like command itself? Outside, the desert night had turned into a vision of war. Fire licked at the edges of fuel drums, tracer rounds carved orange ribbons through the smoke, and somewhere beyond the perimeter, the enemy howled, confident that the base was theirs for the taking. But they hadn't planned for her. "Tanaka," Elena said, her voice low and controlled over the roar of distant gunfire. "Patch me through to all friendly frequencies." He hesitated, eyes wide. "Ma'am, they'll do it." Her tone left no room for debate. The corporal's hands moved automatically, adjusting dials, flipping switches. She took a deep breath and pressed the transmitter. "All stations, this is Nightingale 6. Sector Gamma is compromised. Establish suppressive crossfire north of the breach. Prioritize elevation targets. Anyone still breathing, you fight. You hear me? You fight." For a moment, silence. Then, across the valley, radios crackled to life, frightened soldiers hearing a voice that didn't waver, a voice that cut through chaos like a beacon. The nurse was giving orders, and they were obeying. At the breach, the fight was raw and brutal. Elena moved like water flowing from one position to the next, her rifle tucked tight against her shoulder. Her shots were measured, deliberate. Each one found its mark. Jamil fired beside her, teeth gritted. She wasn't the same terrified private from days ago. Fear had burned away, replaced by something simpler: trust. Elena pointed toward a cluster of muzzle flashes on the ridge. "Shift fire 5 degrees left, on my mark." They adjusted, waited. Now, their rifles barked in unison. The ridge went dark. The breach began to hold. From above, Sergeant Major Davies watched through his scope, shaking his head in disbelief. "She's walking the line," he muttered into the comms. "She's reading the battlefield. You seeing this, Colonel?" In the CIC, Thorne stood frozen, headset on, staring at the tactical map as the chaos began to align. His officers were taking her orders without hesitation. Davies continued, his voice reverent. "She's reorganizing your defense, sir, with 6 people and a radio." Thorne didn't reply. He couldn't. He was still trying to reconcile what he was hearing with what he believed. The nurse he'd humiliated, the one he'd buried under menial work, was now running his war. A younger lieutenant turned to him. "Sir, orders." Thorne hesitated, then quietly said, "Repeat hers." Outside, Elena moved forward, her team of medics and supply clerks now operating like a small infantry unit. They weren't trained for this, but under her command, training didn't matter. Purpose did. "Tanaka, call QRF," she said. "Tell them to reposition to coordinates 81 Alpha. There's a secondary assault team massing there. I want them gone." Tanaka relayed, voice shaking but steady. The reply came back seconds later. The quick reaction force had heard. They moved without hesitation. Minutes later, distant explosions lit up the northern ridge, precise, surgical, devastating. The secondary assault vanished under fire. Elena nodded once, almost imperceptibly. "Good." The line was holding, but not for long. A mortar round exploded 50 meters to her left, throwing sand and shrapnel into the air. Tanaka hit the ground. Jamil screamed. Elena didn't flinch. She grabbed Tanaka by the collar, pulling him behind a barrier. His arm was bleeding, but not bad. "You're fine," she said flatly. "Stay with me." She scanned the ridge through the haze, saw movement, a shimmer of muzzle flare. Another team. She could feel the shift in momentum, the invisible rhythm of the fight. It was like listening to a heartbeat through chaos. "They're trying to flank the eastern tower," she said. "We move now." They crawled through smoke and wreckage, weaving between bodies and shattered barriers. Her motions were deliberate, instinctive. This wasn't guessing, it was memory. She reached a fallen soldier, checked his pulse, took his ammo, whispered something only he could hear, a quiet apology, and kept moving. At the command post, the mood had transformed. Officers who'd been paralyzed minutes ago were now barking precise orders, their panic replaced by focus. Every instruction traced back to a single voice: Nightingale 6. Adjust fire pattern Delta. Redirect drones to cover Gamma breach. Confirm enemy withdrawal on Sector 5. The colonel's staff looked at him for confirmation. He didn't give it. He didn't need to. Because for the first time that night, the base wasn't following him. They were following her. Out on the line, the enemy assault began to falter. Their radio chatter, intercepted by the CIC, was breaking apart: confusion, panic, disbelief. They had expected a clean breach, an easy victory. Instead, they'd met something they couldn't explain, a defense that adapted faster than they could attack. And at the center of it all, the woman they called just a nurse was turning chaos into symmetry. A bullet cracked past her ear, close enough to graze. She didn't react. Jamil, shift left. Tanaka, 2-round bursts, control your breathing. Every order was calm, surgical. She was performing battlefield triage, not on bodies, but on the fight itself. She saw the bigger picture like no one else could. To her, combat was an equation, and every sound, every flicker of light was a variable. And when the last piece clicked, when the equation balanced, she knew it before anyone else. "They're breaking," she said quietly. In the CIC, Thorne stared at the feed as the red icons on the map began to retreat. He didn't shout, didn't celebrate. He just stood there, headset pressed to his ear, listening to her voice fade in and out through the static. "Breach secure," she said. "Maintain suppression, no pursuit, recover wounded first." No triumph, no victory speech, just discipline. The silence that followed was the strangest kind, not peace, not relief, but the sound of awe settling into men's bones. By the time the sun began to rise, the fight was over. The valley was scarred, the base half ruined but still standing. Smoke drifted across the horizon, curling upward like prayers for the dead. Elena walked through the wreckage with her rifle slung across her shoulder, boots crunching over spent shells. She stopped beside a fallen soldier, one of theirs, and knelt. She closed his eyes, whispering something in Russian under her breath. Tanaka and Jamil stood behind her, silent, exhausted, bloodied. They watched her kneel beside the wounded and the dead, moving between them like a priest more than a soldier. And then, as the sky turned gold, the colonel appeared. He walked through the smoke toward her, his uniform smeared with dust and shame. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, from realization. Elena looked up as he approached. Their eyes met. He didn't speak. Words were useless here. Slowly, deliberately, Colonel Thorne raised his hand to his temple and saluted. It wasn't a gesture of authority. It was surrender. For a long moment she just looked at him. Then she nodded, small, silent, a gesture not of pride but understanding. Around them the survivors began to gather. First Davies, then Tanaka, then Jamil. One by one, soldiers across the field stood and faced her, the woman who had saved them, the ghost who had commanded them, and raised their hands in salute. No words, no cheers, just silence. A silence that felt holy. Later that morning, the base doctor came to find her. She was already back in the med tent, cleaning her hands, preparing for rounds. "You should rest," he said softly. "You've been up all night." She didn't look up. "There's work to do." He hesitated. "They're saying you were special operations. That true?" Elena paused, her hands stilling for half a second over a tray of instruments. Then she resumed cleaning. "Stories grow in the dark," she said quietly. "Don't feed them." But outside, the whispers were already alive. Soldiers spoke her name in hushed tones, half reverent, half fearful. They called her Spectre. In the colonel's office, Thorne sat alone, staring at her reopened file, now unredacted, now impossible to unsee. Operation Nightfall, Project Chimera, Ghost Protocol. Decorations never made public, missions that didn't officially exist. He scrolled to the final line. Reassignment recommended, combat fatigue, classified psychological injury, non-combat role advised. He leaned back, the weight of his arrogance pressing on him like a physical thing. He had turned a legend into a nurse. And she had saved his base anyway. He closed the file, rubbing his temples. He had no words for what she'd done, only a single truth forming slowly in his mind, that leadership wasn't in the bars on your collar. It was in the steadiness of your hands when everyone else is shaking. Outside, the desert wind rose again, gentle now, carrying away the last smoke of battle. In the med tent, Alina sat alone, rolling a fresh bandage. Her hands moved with the same quiet purpose as ever. And though the soldiers whispered her call sign, she didn't think of it, didn't need it. She learned long ago that names meant little. It's what you do when no one believes in you that defines who you are. And in that silence, in that calm after the fire, her purpose was simple again. Not to fight, but to heal. What does victory sound like? Out here it isn't cheering, it's breathing. The kind that comes after the chaos when every survivor realizes they're still alive. Morning found FOB Nightingale wrapped in silence. The smoke had thinned to a pale mist that clung to the burned-out sandbags and twisted metal. Sunlight pushed through it in streaks, painting everything gold and gray. The air still tasted of ash. Corporal Tanaka stood outside the med tent, bandaged arm in a sling, watching soldiers carry the wounded toward the choppers. Engines coughed, strained, then lifted. For the first time in hours there was no gunfire, only the wind and the distant, steady voice from inside the tent. Elena Rostova. She hadn't rested. She hadn't even taken off her gloves. Inside, she moved between cots with the same quiet efficiency that had carried her through the night. No dramatics, no emotion, just calm precision, stitching, compressing, saving. Every motion looked rehearsed, every silence intentional. The soldiers watched her like she wasn't human, not out of fear, out of disbelief. How could someone walk through hell and come out composed? Jamil held a saline bag above a wounded man's chest. Her hands trembled from exhaustion, but her voice was steady. "Pressure's holding, ma'am." Alina nodded once. "Good, keep it that way." Her tone wasn't gentle, wasn't harsh. It was steadying. It was what leadership sounded like when shouting had failed. Outside, the base had changed. The survivors from the breach moved slower, quieter. No one joked now. No one called her the nurse. They nodded when she passed, sometimes saluted, but mostly they just watched her, as if afraid that if they looked away, she might vanish. Colonel Thorne moved through the same corridors differently too. The arrogance that once rode his posture had been stripped clean. When people saluted him, he nodded automatically, but his eyes drifted toward the med tent each time, searching for the one person he couldn't command. He finally went there at midday. Alina was hunched over a desk, her sleeves rolled up, writing in her small black notebook. Her hair was tied back, face expressionless. The room smelled faintly of iodine and blood. She didn't look up when he entered. "Captain," he said, clearing his throat, "the perimeter's secure, thanks to you." "Thanks to the soldiers," she corrected softly, still writing. "They did the fighting." He hesitated. "You led it." That made her pause. She closed the notebook and finally met his eyes. There was no anger there, no satisfaction, just an exhausted sort of clarity. Someone had to, she said. Thorne swallowed. Sergeant Major Davies identified you, said you're Spectre. The name lingered between them like a ghost of its own. Alina's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. I looked up your record, Thorne went on quietly. What they let me see anyway, He stopped himself. The words I was wrong felt too small. Alina spared him. You weren't wrong, Colonel. You just saw what I wanted you to see. He frowned. Why hide that kind of experience? God knows we could have used it sooner. She glanced toward the rows of bandaged soldiers resting nearby. Experience like mine costs something, sir. Usually lives. Her tone was soft, but her eyes hardened. Out here, I was hopping to pay it back. Thorne didn't know what to say. The sound of the wind rattled the tense canvas, the desert reminding him that humility came too late for some. He nodded once. You saved us, all of us. That's not something I'll forget. Alina looked back down at her notebook. But don't worship it either. It's not heroism, Colonel, it's debt. That night the base lights flickered against the valley's shadowed walls. The perimeter fires had been doused. The fuel depot was a black crater. But the air felt alive again, a pulse of renewed order. At the center of it stood Alina. She walked the perimeter with Tanaka, clipboard in hand, quietly inspecting repairs. This tower needs a secondary line of sight, she murmured, and reinforce that sandbag wall with steel mesh. Small arms fire will chew through it again. Tanaka scribbled notes. He didn't ask how she knew all this. No one did anymore. Every order she gave felt like truth, like instinct sharpened into logic. At one point he asked, Ma'am, what was Spectre? She didn't stop walking. Not what, she said, who? And who was she? Alina glanced up at the night sky, cold, brilliant stars spread across the black. Someone who forgot what peace sounded like. Then she walked on. Over the next few days, her quiet influence spread. Patrol routes changed, random, unpredictable, tower spacing adjusted, supply lines rerouted underground. Thorne signed every new protocol himself, but the base knew where they came from. Notes written in tight, precise handwriting appeared on his desk each morning. Suggestions, small, efficient, undeniable. No one saw who left them. No one needed to. When the engineers rebuilt the breached barrier, they found a folded scrap of paper inside one of the HESCO frames. On it, written in black ink, every defense is a story. Don't let the enemy learn the ending. They framed it on the wall of the operations tent. At dusk one evening, as the sun bled across the peaks, Jamil found Alina outside the med tent, sitting on an overturned ammo crate. The older woman was rolling a fresh bandage in her hands, not working, just thinking. Jamil hesitated, then sat beside her. Ma'am, can I ask you something? Alina nodded slightly. When they say you were special operations, is it true? Alina's hands didn't stop moving. Does it matter? I guess not, Jamil said softly. I've never seen anyone like you. You didn't yell, you didn't even look scared. Alina smiled faintly, barely there. Fear doesn't go away, you just learn to make it quiet. They sat in silence. The wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of laughter from a distant watchtower, a rare, fragile sound of life returning. You think it'll ever stop? Jamil asked. The fighting. Alina's eyes stayed on the horizon. It always stops, she said. The question is whether we stop with it. Days passed. The desert grew quiet again, too quiet. In the distance, the radio towers clicked faintly, harmless static now, no hidden patterns. Patrols came and went. Life resumed its rhythm. And for a time, Alina let herself believe it might last. She woke before dawn each morning, brewed bitter coffee, wrote in her notebook. Her handwriting grew softer, less coded, more human. She even smiled once faintly, when Tanaka managed to organize the med supplies perfectly on his own. But peace for people like her was never permanent. It was a pause, a silence waiting to be broken. It broke one afternoon. Colonel Thorne entered the med tent without his usual stiffness. He looked older now, wearier, but his eyes carried something else, regret. He stood by her table, saying nothing at first. Then he placed something beside her surgical tools. A hardened satellite phone, direct line. "It's for you," he said quietly. "Command's been trying to reach you. They want a full after-action report from you personally." Alina didn't touch it. She kept cleaning her instruments. "You can send them my notes." "They don't want notes," Thorne said. "They want you. They said your convalescence is over if you want it to be." He hesitated. "They want you back." The words landed between them, like an unwelcome memory. Alina's movement slowed. She set down a scalpel, the reflection of the tense light glinting off the blade. For a long time she didn't answer. Finally she said, "You ever wonder what happens to ghosts when they stop haunting?" Thorne frowned slightly. "They fade, I suppose." She nodded. "Exactly." He studied her face, trying to understand, then quietly stepped back. "Whatever you decide, you've earned the right to choose." Then he left. She sat there a long time after he was gone, staring at the phone. It looked harmless, small, matte black, cold against the table. But she could feel what it carried. The weight of the old world, of missions no one spoke about, of choices that had carved scars she still traced in her sleep. Outside, the wind picked up, fluttering the tent's flap. She reached out not to answer, but to close the box around the phone. Then she leaned back and exhaled slowly. Her eyes drifted to the open flap of the tent, to the mountains beyond. The setting sun turned their peaks crimson, then violet. On the ground outside, half buried in dust, a single brass casing caught the light, the last echo of the battle she'd commanded. It glinted, then faded as the light shifted. Alina watched it for a long moment, her thoughts unreadable. Then she picked up a fresh roll of gauze and began wrapping it, slow, deliberate, careful. Her work was still here. Not in the past, not in the shadows. Here, where hands saved lives instead of taking them. The satellite phone stayed silent. And so did she. That night, Corporal Tanaka walked past the med tent on his way to guard duty. Through the flap, he saw her sitting alone under a lantern, re-rolling bandages, her face calm, almost peaceful. He thought about all the stories spreading through the ranks about Spectre, the ghost, the legend who had commanded the impossible. But the woman inside that tent didn't look like a legend. She looked human, tired, whole. He smiled faintly. Maybe that was the real story. Maybe legends weren't born from glory, but from those who stayed behind when the glory was over. How long can peace last, when the world remembers your name? The days after the battle felt borrowed, too calm, too gentle. The kind of quiet that made soldiers uneasy, like the desert was holding its breath. At dawn, Alina still rose before anyone else. She brewed her coffee in silence, the smell of burnt grounds filling the med tent. Outside, the valley glowed faint orange, and the sand shimmered like glass. Every morning was the same ritual, a way to pretend that normal existed here. But the phone was still there. The black satellite phone sat on the corner of her table, untouched, silent, a reminder that peace was temporary. It seemed to hum even when it didn't ring, a small, dark pulse from a world she had left behind. She ignored it or tried to. By the end of the week, the base had found rhythm again. Patrols resumed. The soldiers, still cautious, laughed a little louder. Someone painted a new emblem on the side of the command post, a simple white outline of angel wings over a red cross. Below it, a single word, Nightingale. Tanaka had started calling her that, half-jokingly. It spread faster than she could stop it. "Ma'am, they're saying the brass might rename the FOB," he told her one morning, adjusting his sling. "After you." Alina didn't look up from her paperwork. "That would be unnecessary," she said. Maybe, but they all think you earned it. She didn't reply. She just kept writing, her pen scratching against the paper like a heartbeat she couldn't quiet. When she was alone again, she whispered under her breath, not a prayer, not a plea, just a statement of truth. They never named things after the living. Later that day, Colonel Thorne approached her as she loaded medical crates. The man who once filled rooms with his confidence now carried himself with something else, restraint. "Command's getting impatient," he said. "They want that call." Elena didn't stop working. "Tell them the line's bad." He folded his arms. "I already did 3 times." She smirked faintly. "You're getting better at lying." Thorne almost smiled. "You think I'm trying to protect you. I'm not. I'm protecting the base. They're sending a transport soon, and they're not asking this time." Her hands froze mid-motion. "When?" 48 hours, he said quietly. "You'll have to meet it." She didn't respond, didn't argue, just nodded once. But inside her chest, something old, something she thought she'd buried, began to stir. That night she couldn't sleep. Outside, the wind sighed through the fences, carrying the dry, metallic scent of sand and spent gunpowder. In the dark, she could hear the faint snore of the wounded, the hum of generators, the low thud of her own pulse. Her eyes drifted to the phone again. The LED light blinked softly, once, twice, steady, an incoming signal. She reached for it, then stopped. Her hand hovered over it, trembling just slightly. She remembered the last time she'd answered one of those calls, a voice on the other end saying, "Spectre, we need you back in theater. One more mission." One more had turned into a year, then another. And somewhere in those endless years of sanctioned shadows, she'd lost the sound of her own heartbeat. She let her hand fall back to her lap. The phone blinked twice more, then went dark. She whispered to the empty room, "Not yet." The next morning, Tanaka found her sitting outside, sipping cold coffee. "You didn't sleep again, did you?" he asked. She shrugged. "Sleep is overrated." He smiled faintly. "The colonel says the brass might want to debrief you in person." She turned her head slightly. "He talks too much." Tanaka hesitated. "You won't go back, will you?" Her eyes softened just a fraction. "Why?" "Because," he said, his voice quieter now, "you seem lighter here, like you finally stopped fighting." She looked at him for a long moment, then almost inaudibly said, "No one ever stops fighting, Corporal. Some of us just choose better battles." By noon, the base was alive with noise again. Supply trucks rattled through the gates. Engineers repaired the last damaged tower. The smell of diesel and dust filled the air. Elena supervised the med station inventory, her sleeves rolled up, eyes tired but alert. Every movement precise, economical, the kind of discipline that came from years of repetition. But there was something different in her today, a weight pressing behind her calm. She caught herself glancing at the horizon every few minutes, like she could already see the aircraft that would take her away. Jamil noticed. "Ma'am, you okay?" Elena forced a smile. "Just thinking." "About leaving?" Elena blinked slowly. "About staying." That evening the horizon turned crimson again, the same blood-colored light that had greeted her arrival months ago. The soldiers were gathered in the mess hall, laughing softly, the sound of life returning to the outpost. Elena sat outside alone, the satellite phone beside her cup. When the call came, it didn't ring. It vibrated, a low, steady pulse like a heart she no longer wanted. She picked it up and pressed it to her ear. A male voice clipped, professional. "Captain Rostova, Spectre, this is Command Actual, do you copy?" She didn't answer. "Captain, we have orders for redeployment. Priority 1. Your evaluation period is over." Still silence. "Captain, confirm receipt." She finally spoke, her voice low, even. "How many lives this time?" The voice hesitated. "That's classified." She exhaled. "Then you already know my answer." There was a pause, then Steele. "This isn't optional, Spectre." "No," she said, "it never was." And she ended the call. The phone lay dark on the table again. Outside, a soft wind rolled through the camp. The stars above the valley shimmered like broken glass. For a long time she sat still, the quiet nurse who had been so many things in other lives, now alone with her thoughts. She knew they wouldn't take no easily. Command never did. But she also knew something they didn't. The ghosts they create don't always come back when called. Hours later, Colonel Thorne entered the tent. The look on his face said he already knew. "They won't stop," he said. "You understand that, right? You've embarrassed half the chain of command just by existing." Elena glanced up. "That's their problem. They'll make it yours. Then I'll survive that too." He chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "You make it sound simple." "It is," she said quietly. "You just stop giving them the parts of you they can use." He studied her face, the faint lines of exhaustion, the calm defiance. "You ever regret it?" She looked at the blood-stained cot beside her, the used bandages, the instruments drying in the dim light. "Every day," she said. "But regret's just another kind of service. You carry it so others don't have to." He nodded slowly. "If they come, I'll stall them." "I know," she said softly. "But you can't protect me, Colonel. I'm not the one who needs it." Thorne sighed. "Then who does?" She looked at him, truly looked, with eyes that had seen too much. "All of them," she whispered. That night the base lights dimmed early. The desert cooled, the stars sharpened, and the wind stilled, as if the world itself was waiting for a decision. Inside the med tent, Elena packed her bag quietly, not for deployment, for movement. Her black notebook went in first, her uniform folded, her dog tags left behind on the table beside the silent phone. She paused at the flap of the tent, glancing back once. The light caught the metal tags, making them gleam faintly. Her reflection in them was fragmented, half nurse, half ghost. Then she stepped out into the darkness. Tanaka found her at dawn, standing near the ridge where the first mortar had landed weeks ago. The desert stretched before her, endless, quiet, forgiving. He hesitated. "You leaving?" She nodded for a while. "Where to?" "Does it matter?" He shook his head. "Guess not." He looked down at the sand, then back at her. "You know, they still talk about that night, how you walked into the storm like you knew how it would end." Elena smiled faintly. "No one knows how it ends, Corporal. We just make peace with where it stops." She placed a hand on his shoulder. "Take care of them, the wounded, the ones who still think the fight out there." He swallowed hard. "And you?" She looked out at the sunrise. "I'll keep mending what I can." Then, almost to herself, she added, "Even ghosts need to heal." As the sun rose, painting the peaks gold, she walked away from the base, her figure small against the vast horizon. The wind caught her hair, lifted the dust around her boots. Behind her, the flag over FOB Nightingale rippled once in the morning breeze. And though no one said it aloud, every soldier watching from the towers knew they'd just seen something sacred, the quiet departure of a legend who'd chosen peace over power. How do you replace someone who never asked to lead you? You don't. You just learn to live in the space they left behind. FOB Nightingale woke to a quieter kind of morning. The med tent lantern still swung from its hook, but the cot beneath it was empty. No duffel, no uniform, no sound of coffee boiling at dawn. Only a folded note on the table, one line in neat black ink. "Keep them alive, ER." Corporal Tanaka found it first. He stood there a long time, the paper trembling slightly in his fingers, before he carried it to Colonel Thorne. Thorne read the words twice, maybe 3 times. Then he closed his hand around the note as if it might disappear. He looked older than he had before the battle, not from fatigue, but from understanding. He had spent his career chasing control. Now control felt like sand in his palm. "She's gone," Tanaka said quietly. Thorne nodded once. "She left us stronger, that's what matters." Outside, engines coughed to life. The base had work to do, always work to do. But there was a hesitation in the rhythm now, a subtle pause between orders, as though everyone felt the absence of the voice that had once steadied them through chaos. Rumor traveled faster than radio. By midday, every soldier knew. Captain Rostova had disappeared into the desert. Some said she'd been recalled to a secret unit. Others whispered she'd gone rogue. A few insisted she'd simply walked home, wherever that was. They started leaving small things near the med tent door. A folded bandage, a spent casing, a note. Tiny offerings to a myth they didn't quite understand. Jamil found Tanaka later, sitting near the old breach wall, turning the note in his hands. "She's really not coming back, is she?" Tanaka looked at the horizon. "I don't think she ever meant to stay." Jamil frowned. "Then why does it feel like she's still here?" He smiled faintly. "Because she taught us how to listen when things go quiet." That evening, the first convoy from Central Command arrived. Dust trailed behind the armored vehicles like smoke. At the front, a sleek black SUV, the kind that didn't belong in war zones, rolled to a stop outside Thorne's office. Two officers stepped out. Clean uniforms, cold eyes. They didn't salute. "Colonel Thorne," the taller one said, "we're here for Captain Rostova." Thorne kept his voice even. "You're late." "Where is she?" He met their gaze. "Gone, left before dawn." The officer's jaw tightened. "Define gone." "She walked out the east gate. Alone, no orders, no escort." The second man scribbled something on a clipboard. "Then she's AWOL." Thorne's eyes hardened. "No, she's done." They exchanged a look. "We'll decide that," the tall one said. "HQ wants debrief. Her actions compromised operational protocols." Thorne leaned forward, his tone sharpening. "Her actions saved this base." "Perhaps," the officer replied coolly, "but unauthorized engagement is still misconduct." The colonel's knuckles whitened. He wanted to tell them what misconduct looked like, bureaucrats playing chess with lives. But Alina's voice echoed in his head. "Don't worship it. It's not heroism, it's debt." So he just said, "You can file your report, but you won't find her." And he was right. By the time command sent drones and patrols, the desert had already erased her footprints. Night came early that day, heavy and windless. Inside the mess hall, the soldiers gathered around tin mugs of bitter coffee. No laughter this time, just the hum of memory. Jamil broke the silence first. "You think she'll really just disappear?" Davies, the old crew chief, shook his head. "SPECTRE doesn't disappear. She just moves where you stop looking." Tanaka stared at his mug. "She said every defense is a story." Davies smiled. "Then maybe this one ain't over." The weeks that followed were strange. Life returned, but not the same. The base ran smoother, quieter. Orders were shorter. There was less shouting, less waste, fewer mistakes. As if her calm had imprinted itself into the walls. Thorne changed too. He stopped using phrases like "my command" or "my men." He listened more. Sometimes he even walked the perimeter at night, alone, tracing the paths she'd once taken, watching the same stars she had watched in silence. He began writing notes of his own, leaving them for the junior officers. "Double-check comms frequencies. Unpredictable saves lives. Quiet doesn't mean safe." Each one ended with 2 letters, ER. It became a quiet ritual, a promise to the ghost who had taught him humility. One morning, a care package arrived with Central Command markings. Inside were medical supplies, encrypted drives, and a sealed folder marked classified/eyes only. Thorne opened it alone. Inside were photos, grainy satellite stills from somewhere deep in the mountains. A single figure walking along a canyon floor. The timestamp was from 48 hours earlier. A note paperclip to the top read, "Target located. Recommend retrieval before foreign capture." Thorne's throat tightened. He stared at the photo until the lines blurred, until he couldn't tell where the desert ended and she began. Then he slid the folder into a drawer and locked it. He wasn't going to betray her location. Not to the people who saw her as a weapon instead of a person. That night the wind changed again, a soft, restless whisper moving through the base. Davies found Thorne standing by the rebuilt breach wall, hands clasped behind his back. "They'll come for her," the sergeant major said. "I know. You gonna stop them." Thorne looked out at the desert. "If I can." Davies chuckled softly. "Hell, Colonel, never thought I'd say this, but you've got a little spectre in you now." Thorne smiled faintly. "We all do." They stood there in silence for a while, the memory of battle still hanging in the air like smoke that would never quite clear. Hundreds of miles away, beyond the reach of radio, Alina moved through a canyon in the early dawn. No convoy, no insignia, just a small pack in the sand under her boots. The horizon glowed faintly pink. She stopped at a ridge and looked back toward the valley she had left. Nothing. Just light and distance. She took out her black notebook, tore out the first page, the one that had once been filled with coordinates and calculations, and let it drift away in the wind. Then she wrote a new line. No mission, no orders, still breathing. She smiled a quiet private smile and kept walking. Back at the base, months passed. Command eventually replaced her file with a single word: inactive. To the bureaucracy, she was finished. To the soldiers, she had become something else, a story told at the edges of campfires. They said she'd once led a battle with nothing but a radio and a heartbeat. They said she could hear patterns in the noise, sense danger in silence. But the older ones never called her Spectre anymore. They called her Captain Rostova, because calling her by name felt more respectful than myth. One night, a sandstorm rolled over the valley. The wind howled, rattling the steel roofs, erasing footprints all over again. Tanaka, now promoted to sergeant, huddled inside the watchtower, checking his equipment. Through the static, he heard something, a faint, rhythmic pulse on an unused frequency. He frowned, adjusted the dial. The pattern repeated, 3 short, 1 long. Not random, intentional. His breath caught. "Ma'am," he whispered to no one. He recorded it, ran it through the system. When the storm cleared by morning, he brought the data to Thorne. The colonel listened, eyes narrowing. "You think it's her?" Tanaka shrugged. "Could be anyone." Thorne smiled sadly. "Could be." But later, when no one was watching, he played the signal again. And for a moment, in the spaces between the static, he could almost hear her voice. Calm, measured, steady as always. He closed his eyes. "Still listening," he whispered. The desert kept its secrets. But at FOB Nightingale, her presence lingered in the order she'd built, in the courage she'd awakened, in the quiet between alarms. Every soldier learned the same unspoken lesson she'd lived by. That leadership isn't noise. It's the silence that holds when everything else breaks. How do you erase someone who already erased herself? At headquarters, they tried. Her file, Rostova E/Captain/Clearance Delta Black, had been opened, closed, and reopened 6 times. Each time it came back thinner, fewer pages, fewer details, until only one word remained stamped across the top: Spectre. The name that never belonged to a person, just a result. And results were all command ever wanted. Weeks passed before the first pursuit order was issued. Objective: locate and retrieve subject SPECTRE. Status: classified deserter. Priority, termination of unauthorized field influence. Termination, not capture, not debrief. Colonel Thorne read the coded transmission in silence. Then he folded it twice, until it disappeared into his palm. He sat alone for a long time afterward, the low hum of the air unit filling the room. The shadows under his eyes had deepened, carved by too many sleepless nights. They were coming for her. And somehow, despite everything, he wasn't surprised. At the same hour, hundreds of miles away, Alina Rostova crouched by a dying fire, staring into its glow. The canyon around her was silent except for the wind whispering through the rocks. She'd grown thinner, quieter part of the landscape now. She ate ration scraps and drank condensed moisture from rock crevices. Every step she took, she covered her tracks. Every sound she measured. Old habits never really die. They just go dormant until the ghosts call them back. In her pack, wrapped in cloth, was a small silver object, her field transmitter. She had thought about destroying it, but something stopped her every time. It wasn't hope. It was curiosity. Some part of her still needed to know if they'd listen. At dawn, she climbed the ridge and scanned the horizon through broken binoculars. The world stretched out before her, endless gold and shadow. No signs of pursuit yet, but she could feel it. The faint shift in the air, the instinct honed by years of missions where failure wasn't recorded, only erased. She sat listening, not for footsteps but for patterns, frequencies buried beneath silence. For hours, nothing. Then faint, fragmented static on a long dead band. 3 short, 1 long. Her pattern. She closed her eyes and exhaled through a quiet smile. Still there, she murmured. The wind carried her voice away before it could echo. Back at FOB Nightingale, Tanaka sat with the same signal recording looping on his tablet. The storm interference had made it almost unreadable, but he couldn't let it go. Jamil leaned against the wall beside him. You've been staring at that static for hours. It's not static, he said. It's her, it has to be. Jamil frowned. If command hears you say that, they'll ship you out for evaluation. Tanaka's jaw tightened. They can evaluate this. He hit play. You hear it, the pulse. She used that pattern before the breach. It's her way of saying she's alive. Jamil sighed. Alive doesn't mean safe. He didn't respond, but deep down he knew she was right. Safety wasn't a word that ever fit Alina Rostova. 3 days later, a recon drone spotted movement near the Joreth Ridge, a single figure traveling east through the dust. No vehicle, no signal beacon. Command flagged it immediately. A special task unit, pale uniforms, no insignia, departed within the hour. They called themselves retrievers. But the men on the inside had another name for them, ghost cleaners. When Thorne received the deployment notice, he knew what it meant. He'd seen those missions before. They didn't come back with prisoners. They came back with silence. He stood by the window of his quarters, watching the dawn creep over the outpost. In the reflection, he saw what the desert had made of him, a man hollowed out by duty. But somewhere behind his eyes, there was still a flicker of the soldier she'd believed he could be. He reached for his radio. Tanaka, my office now. Minutes later, the young sergeant entered, his uniform dusty, his expression tight. Thorne tossed a folder across the desk. You were right, that signal wasn't random. Tanaka's breath caught. She's alive. For now, Thorne said, but not for long. Command sending retrieval teams. You didn't hear that from me. What are we gonna do? Thorne looked at him, steady, grim. You're going to forget we talked, and I'm going to make sure the desert gets one more ghost story. Out in the canyon, Alina had already felt it, the shift. Predators never needed to be seen to be known. She had been hunted before, but never by her own. She moved fast now, conserving motion. Her boots made no sound. Her gear was stripped to essentials: one knife, one pistol, half a canteen, her notebook. As she climbed the rocks toward a high pass, she noticed something glinting near the ridge. Glass, a camera lens. She froze. For one still second, she stared into the sunlight and whispered, "So you finally found me." Then she moved. The retrievers advanced methodically, 4 operatives in matte gray armor, scanning for thermal trails. Their commander, a man with ice-colored eyes, checked his wrist display. "Target heading northeast," he said. "Alive preferred, dead acceptable." They followed in formation. But what they couldn't know, was that the terrain was hers now. She mapped the ridges days ago, marked every fault line, every blind slope. When they reached the first choke point, she was already above them. No gunfire, no shouting, just the dull crack of a stone she dropped from 20 feet up. It hit the comms unit of the lead operative. Sparks, confusion. Then silence. When the others looked up, she was gone. Night fell fast in the canyons. The retrievers regrouped, muttering into their mics. "Thermal's useless," one said. "She's using cold cover, rocks and sand. No heat signature." Command said she was just a medic. The leader's mouth twitched. Then Command never saw what she was before that. Somewhere above them, Alina listened. Their words echoed down through the stone, confirmation of what she already knew. They weren't soldiers. They were janitors, cleaning what embarrassed the machine. She almost laughed. The sound that came out instead was closer to a sigh. "Still cleaning your mistakes," she whispered. Hours later, she reached the canyon's northern edge. Her body ached. Her hands shook from dehydration, but her eyes stayed sharp. In the distance, she saw lights, a small outpost, not military, civilian dig site, abandoned. Shelter or a trap? She hesitated, staring at the faint yellow flicker of generators. Then behind her, a sound, faint gravel crunch. Too deliberate, too careful. She didn't turn, she didn't need to. They were close. So she started running. Back at Nightingale, Tanaka couldn't sleep. He replayed her signal again, the static pulse now memorized like a heartbeat. 3 short, 1 long. Every loop felt heavier, more urgent. Finally, he snapped. He grabbed his pack, rifle, and a stolen Jeep key. When Jamil caught him at the gate, he froze. "You're not going to find her," she said softly. He met her eyes. "Maybe not, but I can make sure they don't either." She wanted to argue. Instead, she stepped aside. "Bring back her notebook if you can." He nodded. "If she'll let me." Then he drove into the dark, the taillights fatting into the dunes like dying embers. Alina reached the dig site just before dawn. The wind howled through hollow structures, scattering dust into the ruins. She slipped inside a derelict control room, her breathing shallow. Old monitors blinked faintly, low power still running. She sat against the wall, unwrapped her transmitter and tuned the dial. She hesitated, then pressed the switch. "FOB Nightingale," she said, her voice raw. "If anyone's still listening, the desert's awake again, and they're coming." For a long moment, there was only static. Then a voice she didn't expect. "Copy that, ma'am, still listening." "Tanaka." Her breath caught. "You shouldn't be here." "Neither should you. They'll kill you for this." "Not if they can't find me first." Despite everything, she smiled, the first real smile in months. "You learned well, Sergeant." "I had a good teacher." The line crackled. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the retrievers were closing in. Alina stood, slinging her pack over her shoulder. "If I don't make it back, tell Thorne." Tanaka cut her off. "No messages, just orders. What do you need?" She paused. "Time." "Then you'll have it," he said, "whatever it costs." Outside, the sun rose over the canyon, bleeding light into the ruins. Alina took a deep breath, eyes fixed on the horizon. Somewhere out there, she knew, The men who had once called her asset were closing in, efficient, relentless, certain. But she also knew something they didn't. You can't retrieve what no longer belongs to you. And you can't kill what has already learned how to live invisible. She pulled her knife from its sheath and whispered, "Let's finish the story." The desert answered with silence, the kind that comes before everything breaks again. What do you fight for when the war finally stops fighting you? The desert was breathing again, slow, patient, ancient. A low wind slid through the canyon, carrying the smell of dust and oil and something faintly human. Sweat, smoke, determination. Elena Rostova crouched in the shadow of a crumbling wall, her pulse steady. The retrievers were near now, 5 of them, not 4. She could hear their boots grind the sand, the metallic click of rifles sweeping arcs across the ruins. She'd been running for 3 days, but she wasn't running anymore. This place, a half-buried research outpost, its walls etched with bullet scars, was where she would stop. Because sometimes, to save what you love, you have to stand where you said you'd never stand again. She checked her magazine, 6 rounds, a knife. Enough for a conversation. From her pack she pulled the small transmitter, the one she'd sworn she'd never touch again. The light blinked weakly, its battery dying. She pressed it once, twice, then held it down. "Sergeant Tanaka," she whispered, "you still out there?" "Static." "Then copy, ma'am, 2 clicks west. I can see the smoke." She exhaled, "Don't come closer. You'll need help." "I need time, you promised me that." Silence, then his voice cracked just slightly. "Understood." She smiled faintly, "Good soldier." The retrievers fanned out through the ruins, moving like machines. They weren't looking for a person anymore. They were looking for a signature, a pattern, a ghost. Visual scan sweep complete. One muttered into his comm, "No movement." "Check heat differentials," the leader ordered. A pause, negative, all cold. He frowned, "Impossible." It was. Elena had spent a lifetime learning how to disappear, even from the kind of men who built their careers finding people like her. She watched them from a second-story window, her reflection fractured across broken glass. They were young, most of them, unscarred, eyes sharp but empty, soldiers without doubt, the most dangerous kind. One of them stopped near her hiding spot. He looked down at the sand, saw nothing, then looked up. Their eyes met for half a second. Recognition flickered, then a burst of gunfire shattered the air. The first round hit the pillar beside her. The second grazed her shoulder. She ducked, rolled, fired once, clean, centered. The young operative fell without a sound. The others converged instantly. Grenade, pin, throw. She dove behind a steel beam as the explosion cracked the wall, showering her with stone dust. Her ears rang, her vision blurred, but her hands were steady. She whispered to herself, "Stay small, stay alive." The mantra of medics under fire. The same words she'd once told Tanaka in the bunker. Now they were hers again. Meanwhile, Tanaka crawled across a ridge half a mile away, his binoculars fixed on the flashes below. Each burst of light punched a hole in the dawn. He radioed, "Nightingale Command, this is Sergeant Tanaka. I've got eyes on contact. Multiple hostiles engaging friendly." Static, then Thorne's voice. "Stand down, Sergeant, that's an unauthorized zone." "Unauthorized's all we ever were," Tanaka muttered. "She's pinned." "Tanaka." He cut the transmission. He'd learned that from her too. Elena moved through the corridors like smoke. Every corner she turned felt smaller, darker. Blood dripped down her sleeve, warm against her skin, but she ignored it. The retrievers were splitting up now, clearing sectors, professional, relentless. She could hear their commands echo through the halls. Target contained. Minimal resistance. Authorization to eliminate if non-compliant. She stopped, leaning against a cracked wall, breathing through the pain. Eliminate. That was the word they used when they were afraid of explaining why. Her gaze dropped to the floor and she saw something half buried in sand. A discarded med patch, faded red cross. She picked it up, thumb brushing the worn fabric. A nurse's patch. For a moment, she wasn't Captain Rostova or Spectre. She was just Elena, the woman who once believed saving lives was enough. She closed her fist around it and stood tall again. Let's finish this. The first retriever rounded the corner. She fired, then moved before the body hit the ground. Two more came from the opposite corridor. She rolled into cover, dropped one with a ricochet off a steel pipe, then ducked as bullets stitched the wall above her. Pain flared in her side. Not mortal, not yet. Enough to remind her she was still human. She tossed a smoke canister, the thick gray veil swallowing everything. Through it, she heard their commander's voice. Rostova, stand down. You're under arrest for insubordination and desertion. She laughed once, soft, hoarse. You can't arrest what you already buried. A single shot answered. The bullet missed, but the message didn't. Outside, Tanaka reached the base of the canyon. He moved fast, low, silent, until he saw one of the retrievers through his scope. He hesitated. They were his own people, technically. But so was she. He exhaled, squeezed the trigger. The man dropped. He didn't feel triumph, only necessity. He kept moving. Inside the ruins, the fight dwindled to silence again. 4 down, 1 left the leader. Elena could hear his boots scraping against stone as he advanced through the dust. Why run, Captain? He called. You know how this ends. She crouched behind a broken console, voice low. If you knew how it ends, you wouldn't be here. He laughed, not cruelly, just tired. Orders are orders. I used to say that too, she murmured, until I learned who wrote them. He stepped into view, weapon raised. Then I guess you've learned too much. Her hand twitched toward her holster, but before either could fire, a rifle cracked from outside. The leader's body jerked once, then fell. A clean shot through the shoulder plate. Elena turned. Tanaka stood in the doorway, rifle smoking, eyes wide. Couldn't stay away, she said, half smiling. Guess not. He ran to her, scanning her wound. You're hit. I've been worse. You always say that. And I'm always right. He tore a strip from his sleeve, pressed it against her side. She winced, then met his eyes. They'll send more. I know. Then you need to leave. Not without you. She almost laughed, stubborn. Learn from the best. For a moment, they just breathed, 2 soldiers standing in the ruins of their own choices. Then she handed him her notebook. Take it back to Nightingale. Give it to Thorne, he'll know what to do. He looked down at it, hesitant. What about you? She smiled faintly. I've got one last patient to stabilize. The sound came before the light, the low, growing hum of incoming drones. She looked up at the sky through the cracked roof, 4 of them descending fast. Tanaka's eyes widened. We can still run. She shook her head. No, if they find both of us, it ends here. Go. He didn't move. Sergeant, she said, her tone firm now, that's an order. His throat worked. Then he nodded, backing away, eyes glistening. For what it's worth, they were wrong about you. She tilted her head. Who? All of them. You were never just a nurse. A small, weary smile crossed her face. That's exactly what I am. Then she turned away, before he could see the tears she wouldn't let fall. When the drones arrived, the ruins were empty except for her. She stood in the open, shoulders squared, blood drying against her sleeve. The rising sun caught her hair, turning it copper against the smoke. She placed her pistol on the ground, raised her hands, and looked straight into the nearest lens. You wanted your ghost, she said softly. Here I am. The machines hovered. waiting for human orders that never came. Then slowly they rose again, disappearing into the clouds. Someone had canceled the strike. Back at FOB Nightingale, Colonel Thorne stood in the command room, headset pressed to his ear. The order screen blinked authorized termination, then flickered, changing to mission aborted/file closed. He exhaled shakily, shoulders collapsing as if the desert itself had lifted off his back. Beside him, Tanaka placed the black notebook on the table. Thorne opened it. Inside were pages filled not with mission codes but with sketches, terrain, human silhouettes, pulse readings, quotes. On the final page, "They said I was just a nurse." Maybe they were right. Because when the world broke, I didn't fire first, I healed what was left. Thorne closed the book gently. "She's still out there," Tanaka said. Thorne nodded. "And as long as someone remembers what she taught us, she always will be." Months later, the desert swallowed the ruins entirely. Wind erased the footprints, sand buried the blood. But sometimes, on quiet nights, soldiers at FOB Nightingale still caught faint static on the old frequency. 3 short, 1 long. Her signature. They'd listen for hours, hearing nothing more. And somehow that silence was enough. At headquarters, the file marked SPECTRE was deleted for the last time. But the machine couldn't erase the field reports that carried her name. They lived in margins, in memories, in the hearts of the soldiers she left behind. Jamil, now the lead medic, kept the faded nurse's patch pinned inside her vest. Tanaka took over patrol command, his orders short, calm, decisive. And Thorne, the once-proud colonel, had learned to speak softly. He never raised his voice again. Sometimes, late at night, he'd walk the perimeter and whisper to the wind, "You did it, Captain, you made us better." And maybe from somewhere out in the endless dark, a voice whispered back, "Not better, Colonel, just human." Because that was her gift, not the mark she left on the battlefield, but the stillness she taught them to find when everything else was burning. And though her story would never appear in any medal ceremony, every soldier who lived because of her carried the same quiet truth. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. And sometimes the ones who heal us under fire are the only reason any of us come home at all.